A black girl gave her last sandwich to a stranger who was crying in the park. The next day, a black SUV appeared in front of her house, and when her mother opened the door, she couldn't believe what she saw. Kiara woke up to the sound of her mom's voice, calm but weary. "Kiara, it's time to get up, sweetheart." Ashley was already dressed, her face looking tired but determined. Kiara blinked the sleep out of her eyes, her room still dark except for the early morning light filtering in through the thin curtains. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the cold wooden floor under her feet as she swung out of bed. Tony, her little brother, was still asleep in the next room. She could hear his soft breathing. Kiara glanced at her mom, who was standing by the stove, stirring something in a small pot. It wasn't much, just some oatmeal, but Ashley always tried to make breakfast for them, no matter what. "Morning, Mom," Kiara said, sitting down at the table. She eyed Tony's cereal bowl, the little that was there. Ashley forced a smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Eat up. You'll need your energy today," Ashley said, handing her the oatmeal. Ashley's face, though smiling, seemed heavier every day. Kiara noticed it, even if she didn't have the words to describe what it meant. The dark circles under her mother's eyes, the long pauses as she looked at her phone, often followed by sighs that seemed endless. "Are you going to be late again tonight, Mom?" Kiara asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, probably," Ashley replied, her voice dropping a bit. "There's a lot I need to catch up on, but I promise to try and be here before bedtime." She turned her back to Kiara, but Kiara knew her mom was hiding her expression. Her mom always did that when she didn't want them to see how worried she was. Kiara finished her breakfast quickly, and as she picked up her plate to take it to the sink, she heard her mom talking on the phone with someone. Kiara didn't mean to listen, but the words rent and delay were clear enough to understand. Ashley noticed her daughter listening and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Go get your uniform on, sweetheart. You're going to be late." Kiara nodded, putting on her uniform, which was patched in a few places. She looked at herself in the mirror, tugging at the hem to try and make it look less worn. She pulled her braids a little tighter, took a deep breath, and walked back into the kitchen where Tony was now awake, playing with his spoon and laughing. "Hey, Ton," she said, ruffling his hair gently, her mood lifting slightly at his bright giggle. Kiara took his hand and helped him to his chair. "I'll get him ready, Mom," Kiara said, and Ashley nodded, giving her a grateful look. "Thanks, baby," Ashley replied. She bent down to kiss Tony on the forehead, then Kiara. "You both are so good for me." Her voice cracked slightly, and Kiara could tell she was holding back tears. Later, Ashley hurried out the door, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Lock it behind me, okay, Kiara?" She blew a kiss to both her kids. Kiara watched her mother leave, the door closing softly behind her. The school day for Kiara passed slowly. She was usually good at paying attention, but today felt harder. Her mind kept drifting back to the look on her mom's face, the bags under her eyes. It felt like something heavy was sitting in Kiara's chest, and she didn't know how to make it go away. By the time school was over, she just wanted to forget it all. She walked home with her small backpack, her shoes crunching over the gravel. When she got back, she found Ashley already home, but on the phone. Her mom's voice was shaky. Kiara knew it was about money again. She waited in silence, watching as Ashley's expression fell deeper with every word she heard from the other side of the line. "Okay, I understand," Ashley said, her voice breaking just slightly before she hung up the phone. Kiara saw her mother slowly sit down on the couch, her head in her hands. Her shoulders looked so small, like they might break under the weight she was carrying. "Mom?" Kiara whispered, taking a step closer. Ashley didn't look up. "Just give me a minute, sweetie, please," Ashley said, her voice barely audible. Kiara's heart sank. She couldn't do anything, and that feeling was worse than anything else. "Can I go to the park after school tomorrow?" Kiara asked, needing a reason to leave the heaviness of the house behind for a bit. Ashley finally looked up, wiping her face quickly. "Sure, sweetheart. Just be back before dark, okay?" Kiara arrived at school the next day feeling the weight of everything at home. She tried to focus, but her teacher's voice was a dull hum in the background. She doodled in her notebook, little swirls and flowers, trying to distract herself from her mother's tired face and the feeling of helplessness that seemed to follow her everywhere. When the last bell rang, Kiara rushed out of the building. She walked quickly toward the park, her backpack bumping against her shoulders. It was still light out, and she wanted to take a moment to forget about everything. As she approached the park, she heard the distant laughter of other kids. They were running, playing, free from the worries she carried. Kiara tried to smile at the sight, but her mind felt too heavy. She found her favorite spot, a small wooden bench under a tree. It wasn't far from where other kids were playing, but it was enough for her to be alone. She pulled out the sandwich her mom had packed, though her appetite was nowhere to be found. She took a small bite, chewing slowly, staring at nothing in particular. That's when she noticed him. On the bench across from hers, a man sat hunched over, elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. His clothes were wrinkled and worn, and his hair looked messy, as if he hadn't combed it in days. He seemed to be crying. His shoulders were shaking. It wasn't loud, but Kiara could see the tears. Kiara swallowed the bit of sandwich in her mouth, feeling her stomach twist. She wasn't used to seeing grown-ups cry, especially not strangers. Something about it made her heart ache. She glanced around. Nobody else seemed to notice the man. They were all too busy with their own lives. She looked back at her sandwich, then at the man again. Without thinking too much about it, she got up. She approached him slowly, unsure if she should say anything. When she was just a few steps away, she cleared her throat. The man looked up, startled. His eyes were red, his face tired. "Hey," Kiara said softly, holding out half of her sandwich. Do you want this?" The man blinked at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. He sat up a bit straighter, looking at the sandwich, and then at Kiara. "You don't have to," he started to say, his voice rough. "It's okay," Kiara insisted, stepping a bit closer. "I have enough. And you look like you could use it." He looked at her, his eyes filling with tears again. But this time there was something else there too. Maybe surprise, maybe a little hope. He took the sandwich from her gently, like he was afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Kiara nodded and sat down on the bench beside him, her feet barely touching the ground. She watched as the man took a bite, his hands trembling a little. He chewed slowly, closing his eyes for a moment, like he was savoring something much more than just the taste. "What's your name?" Kiara asked after a while, her voice quiet. The man looked at her again, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Daniel," he said. "My name's Daniel." "I'm Kiara," she replied, offering him a small smile. "Are you okay?" Daniel let out a shaky breath. "I've been better," he said, looking down at the ground. "It's just, life gets hard sometimes, you know?" Kiara nodded. "Yeah, I know." There was silence for a moment. The only sound was the distant laughter of children playing. Kiara looked at Daniel, noticing how he seemed to shrink into himself, like he was trying to disappear. "Sometimes," she said, breaking the silence. "My mom says that things get better, even if it doesn't feel like it. She says we just need a little bit of kindness to help us keep going." Daniel looked at her, his eyes wide as if her words had struck something deep inside him. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kiara shrugged. "She tries. Things are hard for us too, but she never stops trying." Daniel stared at the sandwich in his hand, then looked back at Kiara. "You're a good kid," he said, his voice breaking again. "You don't even know me, and yet you came over and did this." Kiara didn't know what to say to that, so she just shrugged again. "I guess sometimes people just need a little help," she said simply. Daniel wiped his eyes again and took another bite, the smallest smile starting to form on his lips. They sat there for a few more minutes, neither of them saying much. It was enough, just sitting in silence, sharing a small moment of kindness. After a while, Daniel stood up, his legs shaky. He looked down at Kiara, his expression softer now. "Thank you, Kiara. Really. I don't know what I would have done today without you," he said. Kiara smiled up at him, her own heart feeling a little lighter now. "You're welcome, Daniel." He nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. I hope things get better for you and your mom," he said. "You deserve it." Kiara nodded back. "You too. I hope you feel better." Daniel gave her one last look, something like gratitude in his eyes, before turning and walking away. Kiara watched him go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope all at once. She took a deep breath and turned back toward her bench, finishing the other half of her sandwich. For the first time in a long while, Kiara felt like maybe things really could get better. Not just for Daniel, but for her mom too. She didn't know how or when, but she held on to the feeling as long as she could. After a few more minutes, she stood up, brushing the crumbs off her hands. The sun was getting lower, and it was time to head home. She walked away from the park, her steps lighter than they had been that morning, a small smile on her lips. Kiara made her way home from the park, her thoughts still lingering on Daniel's sad eyes and the shaky smile he gave her before he left. She hoped he was okay. She hoped that her small gesture was enough to make at least a little difference for him. The sun was setting and the air was cooling down, but Kiara felt a small warmth in her chest that hadn't been there earlier. When she opened the front door, she heard the faint noise of the television. Tony was on the floor, playing with his toy cars, and Ashley was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. Kiara could tell by her mother's slumped shoulders that it had been another hard day. "Hey, Mom," Kiara said, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm back." Ashley looked up, giving her daughter a tired smile. "Hey, sweetheart. How was the park?" She tried to hide the papers by shuffling them to the side, but Kiara had already seen them. Letters, bills, more and more reminders of what they owed. "It was nice," Kiara replied, keeping her voice light. I shared my sandwich with someone." She hesitated, unsure if her mom would understand. "There was this man there. He seemed really sad." Ashley paused, then looked at her daughter. "You shared your lunch with him?" she asked, her eyes softening. "Yeah, he looked like he needed it," Kiara said. "He said thank you." Ashley nodded slowly, her expression shifting from exhaustion to something like pride. She reached over and gently brushed a hand over Kiara's head. "You're a good girl, Kiara. I'm proud of you." Kiara smiled, but the moment was short-lived. Ashley's gaze moved back to the stack of bills, her lips pressing into a thin line. The reality of their situation loomed over them like a shadow, and the warmth Kiara had felt began to fade. She didn't want to ask, but the words slipped out anyway. "Mom, are we okay?" she asked quietly. Ashley looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and sadness. She forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're doing our best, sweetie," she said. "Things are just a little tough right now, but we'll figure it out, okay?" Kiara nodded, but she could feel the worry knotting in her stomach. She knew her mom was trying to protect her, but even at 8 years old, she could tell things weren't good. The tension in the air, the way her mom sighed when she thought nobody was listening, it all spoke louder than words. Later that night, as Ashley prepared dinner, Kiara helped Tony with his toys. She could hear her mom's voice in the kitchen, soft and shaky, talking on the phone. Kiara knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but the tone in her mom's voice made her ears perk up. "I understand, sir. I just need a little more time. Please," Ashley said, her voice almost breaking. Kiara held her breath, her hands still on one of Tony's cars. "I know I'm late, but I'm doing my best." There was a long pause and then a soft, "I understand. I'll figure it out." Ashley hung up, and for a moment the silence was thick. Kiara could hear her mom taking deep breaths, the kind she took when she was trying not to cry. Kiara looked down at Tony, who was still playing, unaware of the weight in the room. She gave him a little smile, ruffling his hair. "Hey, Ton, let's help Mom set the table, okay?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Tony giggled and nodded, following her into the kitchen. Ashley was standing by the stove, her back turned to them, her shoulders shaking slightly. Kiara walked up and touched her arm. "Mom, do you need help?" she asked. Ashley wiped her face quickly and turned, her eyes red, but her lips curved in a smile. "Sure, sweetheart. You can set the table, okay?" Kiara nodded, taking the plates from the cabinet. She set the table quietly, trying to pretend she hadn't seen her mom cry. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. All she could do was what her mom asked, even if it didn't feel like enough. Dinner that night was quiet. Tony babbled on about his day, talking about the cartoons he watched and the things he imagined his toy cars doing. Ashley nodded along, but Kiara could see her mom was only half listening, her mind far away. Kiara tried to join in with Tony, tried to make the table feel less heavy, but it was hard when she felt that weight pressing down on her too. After dinner, Ashley sat down on the couch, her head in her hands. Kiara cleaned up the dishes, standing on her tiptoes to reach the sink. She wanted her mom to rest, even if just for a moment. She washed each plate carefully, her small hands moving slowly to make sure she didn't drop anything. "Kiara, you don't have to do that, sweetheart," Ashley called from the living room, her voice tired. "I got it, Mom," Kiara replied. "You should rest." Ashley sighed but didn't argue. Kiara finished washing the dishes, dried her hands, and walked over to her mom. She sat down beside her, leaning her head on Ashley's shoulder. For a long moment they just sat there, neither of them saying anything. Finally, Ashley spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what we're going to do, Kiara." Kiara looked up at her, her heart aching. "We'll be okay, Mom," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. She just needed to say it for both of them. Ashley gave a shaky smile, wrapping her arm around Kiara. "You're my brave girl," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Kiara closed her eyes, holding on to her mom. She didn't know how to fix their problems. She didn't know how to make the bills go away, or how to bring back the happiness that seemed so far out of reach. But she knew she would stay by her mom's side, no matter what. She would keep trying, just like her mom always did. The next day, as Kiara got ready for school, she noticed her mom sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an eviction notice. The word loomed large on the paper, and Kiara felt her stomach drop. She looked away quickly, pretending she hadn't seen it, but the fear stayed with her. "Mom, can I go to the park again after school?" Kiara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ashley looked up, the worry still etched across her face. She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, sweetheart. Just come straight home after." Kiara smiled, trying to keep things normal. "I will, Mom." She kissed Tony on the forehead and headed out the door, her backpack heavy on her shoulders. As she walked to school, the cold morning air stung her cheeks. She held on to the small hope she had left, the memory of Daniel's smile, the feeling that maybe, somehow, a little bit of kindness could change things. Kiara walked to school that morning, her mind still clouded by the eviction notice she'd seen. The paper had looked so official, the words so big and bold that she couldn't ignore them. Her mom always tried to shield her from the worst of it, but this time, there was no hiding it. Kiara took a deep breath, her small legs carrying her as quickly as possible towards the school gates. She needed to make it through the day, and then she could go to the park again. Maybe, just maybe, she'd find some comfort there. When the final bell rang, Kiara rushed out of the classroom, her backpack bouncing against her back. She headed straight for the park, the air crisp against her face as she made her way down the familiar path. The park was busier today with kids running around and parents chatting nearby, but Kiara didn't mind. She made her way to her usual bench, finding it empty, and sat down with a sigh. She took her lunch out of her bag and unwrapped it slowly, her eyes scanning the park. She wasn't expecting to see him again. But there he was, Daniel. He was sitting on the same bench as before, his eyes closed, his head leaned back. He looked different today. Less tired, maybe. Kiara stared for a moment before deciding what to do. She hopped off the bench and made her way over to him, her small feet crunching the leaves beneath them. When she got close enough, she spoke up. "Hey," she said. Daniel's eyes opened, and for a second he looked confused. Then his face softened, and he smiled. "Hey there, Kiara," he said, his voice still a little rough but warmer now. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Kiara shrugged, holding up her lunch. "I come here a lot. Want some?" Daniel smiled wider this time, shaking his head. No, you keep it. I'm okay today." Kiara sat down next to him, unwrapping her sandwich. "You seem better," she said carefully, looking at him from the corner of her eye. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think maybe I am. Thanks to you." He glanced at her, his eyes serious. "You really helped me the other day, you know that?" Kiara smiled, taking a small bite of her sandwich. "I'm glad," she said simply. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Kiara didn't know why, but being around Daniel felt good, like they both understood something about each other, even if they didn't say it out loud. Daniel cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You're a pretty amazing kid, you know that?" he said, his voice soft. "Not many people would have done what you did." Kiara looked at him, shrugging. "My mom says we should be kind when we can, so I try to be." Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Your mom's right," he said, looking down at his hands. He paused, then looked back at Kiara. "How is your mom, by the way?" Kiara hesitated, the image of the eviction notice flashing in her mind. She looked down at her sandwich, her appetite suddenly gone. "She's okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Things are just hard." Daniel watched her, his face softening. He didn't push her to say more. Instead, he nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Life gets like that sometimes," he said quietly. "But it doesn't mean it'll always be that way." Kiara looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Do you really think that?" she asked. Daniel smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point, right?" Kiara nodded slowly, taking in his words. She didn't have anything to say back, but somehow his words made her feel a little better. She looked out at the park, the kids playing, the laughter filling the air. Maybe things wouldn't always be this hard. Maybe there was a way out, even if she couldn't see it yet. Daniel cleared his throat again, pulling her attention back to him. "Listen, Kiara, I've been thinking a lot since that day, and I just want you to know. I want to help if I can," he said, his eyes serious. Kiara blinked, not sure she understood. "Help? How?" Daniel looked away, his brows furrowing. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I want to try. You've already helped me more than you know, and if I can do something for you and your mom, I'd like to." Kiara didn't know what to say. She just stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. No one had ever offered to help them like this before, not in a way that felt so real. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I think my mom could use the help." Daniel smiled, his eyes softening. "Then I'll figure something out." They sat there a while longer, the sun slowly dipping in the sky. Kiara finished her sandwich, the knot in her stomach slowly unwinding. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a while, she felt like maybe they weren't alone. Maybe there was someone out there who cared. Eventually, Daniel stood up, brushing the leaves off his pants. He looked down at Kiara, his expression filled with warmth. "I'll see you around, Kiara," he said. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Kiara nodded, smiling up at him. "You too, Daniel." He gave her one last nod before turning and walking away, his steps steady. Kiara watched him go, a small smile on her lips. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she felt a little lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Kiara stayed on the bench for a while longer, watching the sky turn orange as the sun set. She took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. She wasn't sure how Daniel could help, or what he could do to make things better for her mom. But the fact that he wanted to try, that meant something. It meant they weren't alone. When she finally got up to head home, she felt a small flicker of hope in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. She walked back down the path, her footsteps light, her heart feeling just a little less heavy. That night, Kiara helped her mom with dinner again, setting the table while Ashley worked at the stove. The tension was still there, but it felt a little less suffocating. Kiara didn't mention Daniel. She didn't know how to explain it yet, but she knew that somehow something had changed. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Kiara went through her usual routine, waking up early, helping Tony get ready, and making sure her mom didn't forget her lunch as she headed out for work. Ashley's face was still tired, and there was a quiet, somber air around her that Kiara was starting to get used to. The eviction notice still weighed on both of them, like an invisible cloud hanging over the small kitchen as they sat down for breakfast. Ashley tried to smile at Kiara and Tony as she poured coffee into her mug, but Kiara could see right through it. It was a tired, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "All right, you two. Behave today, okay?" she said, her voice cracked at the edges. "We will, Mom," Kiara said, giving her mom a quick hug. She watched as Ashley left, her shoulders drooping as she walked through the front door. Kiara locked it behind her, then turned to Tony, who was still playing with his toy cars. The school day dragged on again, the teachers talking about things that didn't seem to matter much to Kiara. She kept thinking about Daniel, about his words. "I want to help." She wasn't sure what he could do, but she felt a glimmer of hope every time she remembered it. And that small bit of hope was enough to keep her going through the dull lessons and long hours. After school, Kiara went back home, picking Tony up along the way from the daycare. He chattered non-stop, and Kiara listened, nodding along, her thoughts drifting. When they got to their street, something immediately caught her eye. A large black SUV parked right in front of their house. Kiara's steps slowed, her heart skipping a beat. Tony noticed and tugged on her hand. "What's that car, Kai?" he asked, his small voice full of curiosity. I don't know," Kiara replied, her eyes glued to the SUV. It was shiny, the kind of car that looked like it belonged to someone important. She held Tony's hand tighter as they approached the house. The car door opened, and Kiara felt her stomach twist. A man stepped out. It was Daniel. He was dressed differently today, cleaner clothes, his hair combed back. He looked out of place standing there, in front of their small, worn-down house. He smiled when he saw Kiara. "Hey, Kiara," Daniel said, his voice gentle. I hope you don't mind me stopping by." Kiara blinked, her heart racing. She looked at Tony, who was staring up at Daniel with wide eyes. "Daniel?" she said, almost not believing he was standing there. "What are you doing here?" Daniel took a step closer, glancing at the front door of the house. I wanted to talk to your mom. Is she home?" he asked, his voice careful, almost hesitant. Kiara shook her head. "No, she's at work. She'll be back later," she said, her mind spinning. "Why do you need to talk to her?" Daniel smiled a little, though there was something nervous in his eyes. I wanted to help. I wanted to see if there was anything I could do." Kiara stared at him, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought he would actually come here, to their home. She looked at the SUV again, the shiny car that looked so out of place on their street. A million thoughts were running through her head, and she didn't know which one to grab onto. Are you really here to help us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel nodded, his eyes softening. "Yes, Kiara, I promise. I want to help." Kiara took a deep breath, her eyes stinging. She looked at Tony, who was still watching Daniel, his small face full of confusion. She didn't know what to do, but she felt like maybe, just maybe, this could be the answer they needed. "Do you want to come inside?" she asked, her voice shaky. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. If it's okay with you." Kiara led Tony up the steps, unlocking the front door and pushing it open. She motioned for Daniel to follow, and he stepped inside, looking around at their small living room. It was cramped, with Tony's toys scattered across the floor, the couch cushions worn and frayed. Daniel took it all in, his face softening as he did. "Please sit," Kiara said, gesturing to the couch. She sat down beside Tony, who had climbed up next to her, his toy car still in his hands. Daniel sat across from them, leaning forward slightly, his eyes on Kiara. "When is your mom going to be back?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. Kiara shrugged. "Not for a few more hours, I think. She works late." Daniel nodded, his eyes drifting to the stack of papers on the small table beside the couch. The eviction notice was right on top, the big red letters standing out. Kiara followed his gaze, her heart sinking. She reached over, trying to hide it, but Daniel had already seen. "Is that the rent?" he asked, his voice gentle. Kiara nodded, her throat tightening. She looked down at Tony, who was playing with his toy, oblivious to what was happening. "It's been hard," she said, her voice cracking. "My mom, she's trying, but we don't have enough." Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes filling with something Kiara couldn't quite place. Pity, sadness, maybe determination. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I'm going to help, Kiara," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm going to make sure you and your mom don't lose your home." Kiara looked at him, her eyes wide. She didn't know if she should believe him, if she should let herself hope. But something about the way he said it, the way he looked at her, she wanted to believe him. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you want to help us?" Daniel smiled, a sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because someone once helped me, Kiara," he said, "and I know what it feels like to think there's no way out. I don't want that for you or your mom." Kiara swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with tears. She didn't say anything, just nodded. Tony looked up then, his small eyes curious. He pointed at Daniel. "Who's that, Kai?" he asked. Kiara gave a shaky smile, her hand resting on Tony's head. "This is Daniel, Ton. He's a friend." Tony nodded, then went back to his toy, completely satisfied with that answer. Daniel smiled, his eyes softening as he watched Tony. He looked back at Kiara, his expression serious. "I'll come back later when your mom's home," he said. "I'd like to talk to her if that's okay." Kiara nodded again, her heart pounding. She didn't know what her mom would say, but she knew they needed help. And maybe Daniel was the answer they'd been waiting for. Daniel stood up, giving Kiara one last smile before turning towards the door. "Take care, Kiara. I'll be back," he said. "Okay," Kiara replied, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel opened the door and stepped out, closing it gently behind him. Kiara sat there for a long moment, staring at the door, her mind racing. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe there was a chance things could change. She looked down at Tony, who was still playing, his small face filled with concentration. She smiled, brushing a hand over his hair. "Maybe things will get better, Ton," she whispered. He looked up at her, smiling back, though he didn't understand. And Kiara held on to that small smile like a lifeline. The day passed slowly, and as the sun began to set, Kiara's nerves began to build. She kept looking out the window, waiting for her mom to come home. When she finally heard the familiar sound of her mom's footsteps outside, her heart leapt into her throat. The door opened, and Ashley stepped inside, her face lined with exhaustion. She looked at Kiara, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of her daughter sitting there, waiting. "Hey, sweetheart. What's going on?" Ashley asked, her voice weary. "Mom, someone came by today," Kiara said, her voice trembling. "His name is Daniel. He wants to help us." Ashley frowned, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Daniel?" she repeated. "Who's Daniel?" Kiara took a deep breath, her heart pounding. He's someone I met at the park. He said he wants to help with the rent. He said he'd come back later to talk to you." Ashley stared at her eyes wide, disbelief written across her face. "Kiara, are you sure? We don't even know this man." Kiara nodded, her voice soft. "I know, Mom, but I think he really wants to help. He seemed honest." Ashley shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. She looked at the stack of bills on the table, then back at Kiara. "I don't know, Kiara. I don't know if we can trust him." Kiara reached out, taking her mom's hand. "Please, Mom, just talk to him. Maybe he really can help." Ashley took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment. Then she nodded, her shoulders sagging. "Okay, sweetheart, I'll talk to him." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small living room. Ashley sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her expression a mix of exhaustion and worry. Kiara sat next to her, holding Tony in her arms as he drifted off to sleep. They both waited in silence, the minutes ticking by as they waited for Daniel to return. Kiara could feel the tension radiating from her mother. Ashley kept glancing at the door, then at Kiara, her eyes filled with questions she hadn't asked yet. Kiara knew her mom was scared. Scared of strangers, scared of accepting help, scared of what might happen if things went wrong. But Kiara also knew that they needed this. They needed something, anything, to give them a chance. The knock on the door came just as the last of the daylight disappeared. Ashley's eyes shot to the door, her breath catching in her throat. Kiara looked at her mom, then slowly stood up, carrying Tony over to the small mattress they kept in the corner. She laid him down gently, covering him with a blanket before turning back to her mother. "Mom, it's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ashley swallowed hard, then nodded. She stood up, her legs shaky as she walked over to the door. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was Daniel, standing in the dim light of the porch, his hands shoved into his pockets. He gave Ashley a small, nervous smile. "Hi, Mrs. Ashley, I'm Daniel," he said, his voice careful. I'm, a friend of Kiara's." Ashley stared at him for a moment, her eyes scanning his face, his clothes, his posture. Finally, she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice tense. Daniel stepped inside, looking around the small room. He spotted Kiara and gave her a nod. "Hey, Kiara," he said softly. He then turned to Ashley, his expression serious. "Thank you for letting me come by." Ashley closed the door behind him, then motioned for him to sit on the couch. She sat down in the chair across from him, her hands still folded in her lap. Kiara stood by the side, her eyes darting between her mom and Daniel. "What do you want, Daniel?" Ashley asked, her voice direct. "My daughter told me you wanted to help, but I don't know you. I don't know why you're here." Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Ashley's. "I understand, Mrs. Ashley. I know it's strange, but I want to help because Kiara helped me," he said, his voice steady. "I was in a very dark place. I was lost and I didn't know what to do. And your daughter, she came up to me, a complete stranger, and offered me her lunch. She didn't know me, but she helped me when I needed it most." Ashley's eyes softened slightly, her gaze shifting to Kiara, who was watching silently. Ashley took a deep breath, then looked back at Daniel. "That's kind of you to say, but help isn't something we can afford to depend on, especially from someone we barely know," she said. Daniel nodded, his expression understanding. "I get that, I really do, but I've thought about this a lot, and I want to do whatever I can to help. I know things are tough for you right now. I saw the eviction notice, and I don't want to overstep, but I can pay the rent for a few months. It's not charity, it's just someone who's been helped wanting to give back." Ashley's eyes widened slightly, and she looked at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You don't even know us." Daniel smiled, a sad smile that barely lifted the corners of his mouth. "Because I was helped once too. When I was at my lowest, someone reached out to me, and it changed my life. I can't sit by and do nothing when I have a chance to help someone else, especially not after what Kiara did for me." Ashley's gaze shifted to the stack of papers on the table, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Accepting help. It's hard. It makes you feel like you can't stand on your own." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "I understand that. I know it feels like that. But sometimes letting someone help doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're giving yourself a chance to breathe, to rest for a little while." Ashley looked away, her eyes brimming with tears. She wiped at them quickly, her shoulders sagging. Kiara stepped closer to her mom, her heart pounding. She could see how much her mom was struggling, how scared she was to accept this offer, but also how desperately she wanted to. "Mom," Kiara said softly, her voice trembling. Maybe it's okay to let someone help. Just this once." Ashley looked up at her daughter, her eyes filled with tears. She took a shaky breath, then looked back at Daniel. "If we do this, what does that mean? For you? For us?" Daniel smiled, his eyes softening. "It means you get a little more time to catch your breath," he said. "It means you don't have to worry about losing your home, at least for a few months, and for me, it means I get to give back, to pay it forward. No strings attached." Ashley closed her eyes, her hands covering her face as she let out a long, shaky breath. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Kiara held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, Ashley looked up, her eyes meeting Daniel's. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, we'll accept your help." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing. He nodded, his eyes filled with relief. "Thank you," he said softly. "You won't regret this, I promise." Ashley nodded, her hands still trembling slightly. She looked at Kiara, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. Kiara smiled, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around her mom. Ashley hugged her back tightly, her tears finally spilling over. Daniel watched them, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He stood up, giving them both a small smile. "I'll take care of everything with the rent. You don't need to worry about it," he said. "I'll leave my number here and you can call me if you need anything else." Ashley nodded, her voice cracking as she said, "Thank you, Daniel." Daniel smiled again, then turned towards the door. He paused for a moment, looking back at Kiara. "Thank you, Kiara," he said, his voice full of emotion. "For everything." Kiara nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Daniel." He nodded, then opened the door and stepped out, closing it gently behind him. Ashley and Kiara sat there for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Ashley let out a shaky breath, looking down at Kiara. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're really going to be okay." Kiara smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. "Yeah, Mom," she said, her voice soft. "We're going to be okay." Ashley hugged her daughter tightly, her tears flowing freely now. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe it. The following morning, Kiara woke up feeling a little different. The heavy knot that had always seemed to sit in her stomach was still there, but it felt lighter, almost bearable. She stretched her arms and got out of bed, the early morning light creeping through the thin curtains. She heard her mom in the kitchen, the smell of toast wafting through the small house. Tony was still asleep, sprawled out across his mattress with his toy cars scattered around him. Kiara smiled and tiptoed past him, trying not to wake him just yet. She walked into the kitchen and found her mom standing by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. "Morning, Mom," Kiara said, her voice still groggy. Ashley turned around, her face looking a little softer than it had in a while. There was a tiredness in her eyes that hadn't left, but the weight on her shoulders seemed lighter. She smiled at Kiara, her eyes a little brighter. "Morning, sweetheart. How'd you sleep?" Kiara shrugged, walking over to help set the table. "Okay, I guess. Better than usual." Ashley nodded, turning back to the stove. "Good," she said softly. "We all need a good sleep right now." They ate breakfast quietly, the house still mostly silent except for the occasional clinking of spoons. Tony eventually woke up, running into the kitchen with a sleepy grin. He climbed into his chair, and Kiara handed him a small bowl of oatmeal. He giggled, mumbling a quick "thank you" before shoving a spoonful into his mouth. Ashley sat across from them, her eyes scanning the room. It wasn't much. Just a small kitchen, worn-out chairs, and a few mismatched dishes. But today, it felt like enough. For the first time in a long time, Ashley felt like maybe things really would be okay. They had a roof over their heads at least for a little while longer, and that was something. "After school, can we get ice cream, Mom?" Tony asked suddenly, his voice bright with excitement. Ashley blinked, a small smile tugging at her lips. She looked at Kiara, then at Tony. "Maybe," she said, her voice careful. "We'll see how the day goes, okay?" Tony nodded, clearly satisfied with that answer. Kiara smiled too, her heart swelling with hope. It was a small thing, just the promise of maybe getting ice cream, but it felt like a promise of something more, a promise that things were starting to change. After breakfast, Kiara helped her mom clear the table while Ashley prepared for work. Ashley packed a small lunch, slipping the last of the sandwich bread into her bag. She looked over at Kiara, her eyes softening. "Are you okay walking Tony to daycare today?" Ashley asked. "I have to head out early." Kiara nodded, giving her mom a small smile. "Of course, Mom. I got it." Ashley smiled, brushing a hand over Kiara's hair. "Thank you, sweetheart. I don't know what I'd do without you." They hugged for a long moment before Ashley finally pulled away, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. She paused, looking back at Kiara and Tony. "I'll see you both later, okay? Be good." "We will, Mom," Kiara said, her voice soft. Ashley nodded and stepped out the door, closing it behind her. Kiara watched her go, then turned to Tony, who was still finishing his oatmeal. "Come on, Ton, let's get ready for daycare," she said, her voice light. The day passed by in a blur. Kiara went through her classes, trying her best to focus on what the teachers were saying. She found herself staring out the window more often than usual, her mind wandering back to her mom, to Daniel, to everything that had happened over the last few days. She still couldn't believe it. Someone had actually come to help them. It felt like a dream, like something that only happened in stories. But it was real. It was really happening. After school, Kiara picked up Tony and walked home. They chatted about their days, Tony talking animatedly about the toys he'd played with and the friends he'd made. When they got home, Ashley was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a small stack of papers in front of her. Her face looked tired, but there was a sense of calm there that hadn't been there in a long time. "Hey, Mom," Kiara said, stepping inside with Tony at her heels. "Hey, sweetheart," Ashley said, giving them a small smile. "How was your day?" "It was good," Kiara said. She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Did you, talk to Daniel?" Ashley nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, I did. He came by today while you were at school. He's already started taking care of the rent. We're going to be okay for a little while longer." Kiara felt a wave of relief wash over her, her shoulders relaxing. "That's really good, Mom," she said softly. Ashley nodded, her eyes misting over. "Yeah, it is. It feels like we finally have a little time to breathe." They sat down together, Tony climbing into Ashley's lap, still too young to understand everything that was happening, but content in the calm atmosphere of the room. Ashley hugged him tightly, her eyes closing for a moment. She looked over at Kiara, her expression serious. "We have to be careful, though," Ashley said. "Just because we have help doesn't mean we can relax completely. I want to make sure we're prepared, that we use this time to get things in order." Kiara nodded, understanding. "What do you mean, Mom?" Ashley took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the small room. "I want to look into some options," she said. "Maybe there's a course I can take. Something to help me find a better job. Something that pays enough to keep us going. We have a little bit of a cushion now, thanks to Daniel, but we need to make sure we're ready when that help runs out." Kiara felt a swell of pride in her chest, watching her mom speak with determination. This was the mom she knew, the mom who never gave up, no matter how hard things got. She nodded, her eyes bright. "I think that's a great idea, Mom. Whatever you need, I'll help." Ashley smiled, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, sweetheart. I don't know what I'd do without you." The next few days passed in a blur of small changes and new routines. Ashley began making calls, researching night classes she could take to gain more skills. Kiara watched her mom throw herself into this new plan, her eyes filled with hope and determination. It wasn't easy. Ashley was still working long hours, still trying to make ends meet. But now, there was something else. A new spark that hadn't been there before. Kiara felt the change too. She focused more at school, her mind a little lighter now that the constant worry wasn't looming over her head. She laughed more with Tony, played with him in the evenings, and helped her mom whenever she could. It wasn't perfect. They still had their struggles, still had their bad days, but there was hope now, and that made all the difference. One evening, Daniel came by again. He knocked on the door, and when Ashley opened it, he stood there, a small smile on his face. "I just wanted to check in, see how things are going," he said, his voice gentle. Ashley invited him in, and they sat in the living room, talking quietly, while Kiara played with Tony nearby. Ashley told Daniel about her plans, about the classes she was looking into. Daniel listened, his eyes filled with respect and admiration. "That's a really good idea. Daniel said, nodding. I think that's going to help a lot. Ashley smiled, her eyes softening. I hope so. I want to be able to stand on my own, to take care of my kids without always worrying. Daniel nodded again, his expression serious. You're doing an amazing job, Mrs. Ashley, and I want you to know I'll help in any way I can. Not just with money. If you need anything at all, just let me know. Ashley's eyes misted over and she nodded. Thank you, Daniel. I can't tell you how much that means to me. Daniel smiled, glancing over at Kiara, who was watching quietly. He gave her a small nod, and she smiled back, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't know how they'd gotten so lucky, but she wasn't going to question it. She was just going to be thankful. As Daniel stood up to leave, he looked back at Ashley. Just keep believing in yourself, he said. You've got this. Ashley nodded, her eyes bright with determination. I will. Thank you, Daniel. He nodded, then turned and walked out the door, leaving them in the quiet warmth of their small home. Ashley looked over at Kiara, her eyes filled with emotion. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. We're really going to be okay, she said. Kiara nodded, her heart feeling light. Yeah, Mom. We're really going to be okay. The days began to stretch into a new routine, and with it came a sense of stability that Ashley hadn't felt in a long time. She was still juggling work and taking care of her kids, but she now had something new, a focus on building something better for her family. With Daniel's help covering the rent for a few months, Ashley felt like she had been given a rare opportunity to change the course of their lives, and she was determined to make the most of it. One morning, Kiara woke up early to find her mom sitting at the kitchen table looking at her phone. Ashley was scribbling notes into a small notebook, her face focused and determined. Kiara rubbed her eyes and walked over, leaning against the table. Morning, Mom, she said, her voice still thick with sleep. What are you doing? Ashley looked up, her eyes brightening when she saw Kiara. Morning, sweetheart, she said, a smile forming on her lips. I'm just looking at some courses. There's one starting next week. It's a certification in bookkeeping. I think it might help me find something more stable. Kiara's eyes widened, and she felt a spark of excitement. That's great, Mom, she said, her voice enthusiastic. I bet you'll be amazing at it. Ashley smiled, her eyes misting over slightly. I hope so, Kiara. I want to make things better for us. I want to give you and Tony the life you deserve. Kiara reached out, taking her mom's hand. You're already doing that, Mom. You're the best. Ashley squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes filled with emotion. Thank you, sweetheart. I don't know what I'd do without you. They spent the rest of the morning getting ready, the house filled with a new kind of energy, a hopeful one. Kiara helped Tony get dressed, his small hands fumbling with the buttons on his shirt. He was still too young to fully understand everything that was happening, but he could sense the change. The tension that had filled the house for so long had begun to fade, replaced by something lighter. When Kiara returned from school that afternoon, she found her mom sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel. Ashley had a pile of papers in front of her, and Daniel was explaining something, his voice patient and calm. So, with this, you'll need to submit the forms before the class starts, Daniel said, pointing to one of the papers. I can help you get everything sorted if you need. Ashley nodded, her eyes focused. Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it. Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair. It's no problem at all. I'm just happy to help. Kiara stepped inside, dropping her backpack onto the floor. Daniel turned and smiled at her. Hey, Kiara, he said. How was school? Hey, Daniel, Kiara said, walking over to the table. It was okay. What's going on? Ashley looked at her daughter, her smile widening. Daniel's helping me figure out the paperwork for the bookkeeping course. I'm going to start next week." Kiara felt her heart swell with pride. "That's amazing, Mom," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You're going to do great." Ashley's smile faltered for a moment, and she let out a shaky breath. "I hope so, Kiara," she said softly. "It's a big step, and I'm a little scared." Daniel nodded, his voice gentle. "It's normal to feel that way, but you're doing the right thing, Ashley. This is going to help a lot." Ashley took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Daniel's. "Thank you for believing in me," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm trying, for my kids. I want them to see that things can get better." Kiara watched as Daniel gave her mom a reassuring smile. "And they will," he said. "This is the beginning of something new, and I know you'll make it work." The rest of the evening passed in a flurry of preparations. Ashley went over the paperwork again and again, making sure everything was in order. Kiara helped Tony with his dinner, her eyes occasionally drifting over to her mom. She could see the determination in Ashley's face, the spark that hadn't been there before. It filled Kiara with hope, a hope that maybe things really could change. The following week, Ashley began her classes. She worked during the day, and in the evenings, she went to the community center for the bookkeeping course. It wasn't easy. Ashley came home every night looking tired, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. But there was something else there too, a sense of pride, of purpose, that hadn't been there before. Kiara did her best to help around the house, making sure Tony was fed and ready for bed by the time Ashley got home. She could see how hard her mom was working, and she wanted to do everything she could to make things easier. Some nights, Ashley would sit with Kiara after class, her notebook open, going over the things she had learned. Kiara would listen, nodding along, even if she didn't understand everything. One night, after Ashley had returned from class, she sat at the kitchen table with a small smile on her face. Kiara watched as her mom opened her notebook, flipping through the pages. "How was class, Mom?" Kiara asked, her voice curious. Ashley looked up, her eyes filled with excitement. "It was really good, sweetheart," she said. "I'm learning a lot, and I think this might really help us." Kiara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I know it will, Mom. You're so smart. You can do anything." Ashley's eyes misted over, and she reached out, brushing a hand over Kiara's cheek. "Thank you, Kiara. I couldn't do any of this without you. You give me the strength to keep going." Kiara felt her eyes sting, and she leaned into her mom's touch. "We're a team, Mom. We're going to get through this together." Ashley nodded, her voice cracking. "Yes, sweetheart. Together." A few days later, Daniel came by again. This time, he brought a bag of groceries, setting them on the kitchen counter with a smile. Ashley looked at him, her eyes wide. "Daniel, you didn't have to do this," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "I know," Daniel said, his smile widening. "But I wanted to. I thought it might help, just a little." Ashley looked at the groceries, her eyes misting over. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Daniel. You've done so much for us already." Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "It's the least I can do. Besides, I like seeing you all doing well. It makes me happy." Kiara watched the exchange, her heart swelling with gratitude. She still couldn't believe how much had changed, how someone like Daniel had come into their lives and made everything feel different. She walked over and gave Daniel a hug, her small arms wrapping around him tightly. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking. Daniel smiled, patting her back gently. "You're very welcome, Kiara. You and your family deserve this. You deserve to be happy." As Daniel left that evening, Ashley looked over at Kiara, her eyes filled with hope. "We're going to make it, Kiara," she said softly. "We're really going to make it." Kiara nodded, her heart feeling light. "I know, Mom. I know we are. Over the next few weeks, Ashley continued her classes, her confidence growing with each passing day. She began to talk about applying for new jobs, ones that paid more and offered stability. She still worked long hours, still juggled everything that came with being a single mother, but now she had a goal, a way out of the cycle they had been stuck in for so long. And through it all, Daniel continued to be there for them. He stopped by occasionally, always checking in, always offering help where he could. He became more than just a stranger from the park. He became a friend, a part of their family. And with his support, Ashley and Kiara began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could really be different. One evening, as the sun set outside, Kiara sat with her mom at the kitchen table, the two of them going over Ashley's notes from her class. Tony was playing on the floor, his small voice filling the room with laughter. Ashley looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with gratitude. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Kiara. You're my strength. You always have been. Kiara smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. And you're mine, Mom. We're in this together. Ashley nodded, her heart swelling with love for her daughter. Yes, sweetheart. Together. And for the first time in a long time, they both believed it. They believed that no matter what came next, they would face it together, with hope and determination. They were planting the seeds of a new future, one that was filled with possibility and light. And they knew that, with each other by their sides, they could face anything that came their way. The next morning, Kiara woke up with a sense of excitement that she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the weekend, which meant her mom wasn't working, and today, they were planning on doing something they hadn't done in forever, spend time together without the burden of bills, stress, and exhaustion weighing them down. Ashley had promised Tony that they would go for ice cream, a small luxury that felt monumental, given everything they'd been through. Kiara slipped out of bed, her feet touching the cold wooden floor, and she quickly padded over to Tony's mattress. He was already awake, his big eyes blinking up at her. She smiled down at him, brushing a hand over his messy hair. Hey, Ton. Ready for today? She whispered. Tony grinned, nodding excitedly. Ice cream? He asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Yup, Kiara said, giving him a thumbs up. We're getting ice cream today. The two of them got ready quietly, Kiara helping Tony change into a clean shirt while she hummed a soft tune to keep him entertained. When they went to the kitchen, they found their mom already there, her hair tied back and a bright smile on her face. Good morning, you two, Ashley said, her voice cheerful. Guess what? What? Tony asked, his eyes widening with curiosity. I made pancakes, Ashley said, holding up a plate of small, golden brown pancakes. Tony's eyes lit up, and he bounced on his feet, clapping his hands together. Pancakes, he squealed. Kiara smiled, her heart swelling. The little things felt big today. Pancakes, a morning without worry, the promise of ice cream later. She walked over to her mom, giving her a quick hug. Thanks, Mom, she said softly. Ashley hugged her back, her arms wrapping around Kiara tightly. We deserve a nice day, she said, her voice cracking slightly. We really do. They ate breakfast together, Tony giggling as Ashley made a face while flipping a pancake that had stuck to the pan. Kiara watched her mom's eyes, brighter, more alive, and she couldn't help but feel hopeful. It felt like the sun was finally coming out after a long, dark storm. Once breakfast was over, Ashley got Tony ready while Kiara cleaned up the dishes. Ashley wore a small smile the entire time, brushing Tony's hair and making sure his shoes were on right. There you go, little man, she said, ruffling his hair playfully. Tony grinned, his excitement practically bubbling over. When they were all ready, Ashley led them out the door, locking it behind them. The air was crisp, and the sun shone bright in the sky. Kiara held Tony's hand as they walked down the street, and Ashley walked beside them, her eyes scanning their neighborhood. It still looked the same: run-down houses, broken sidewalks, peeling paint. But today it felt different. Today it felt like there was hope. As they made their way to the ice cream shop, Ashley looked at Kiara, her expression softening. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "this is the first time in a long time that I feel like we can actually take a breath, like we're not just trying to survive." Kiara nodded, her heart swelling. "I know, Mom," she said. "It feels good. It feels like things are finally changing." Ashley smiled, her eyes misting over. "It's all thanks to you, Kiara. You never gave up. You always kept hoping, even when I couldn't." Kiara looked down at Tony, who was babbling about the flavor of ice cream he wanted. She squeezed his hand, her chest feeling full. "It wasn't just me, Mom. It was all of us. We did this together." They reached the ice cream shop, and Tony practically dragged them inside, his excitement impossible to contain. The small shop was cozy, the walls painted a bright blue, and the air smelled of sugar and vanilla. Kiara felt a smile tugging at her lips as Tony pointed at the flavors, his small finger jabbing the glass. "I want that one," he said, his eyes wide with excitement. "The blue one." Ashley laughed, nodding. "Okay, Ton, okay, the blue one it is." She looked at Kiara, her smile softening. "What about you, sweetheart?" Kiara looked at the flavors, then pointed at one. "Chocolate, please." Ashley nodded, ordering the ice cream and paying for it with a small smile. It wasn't much, just 3 cones, but it felt like so much more. It felt like a celebration, a small miracle in the midst of everything they had been through. They sat at one of the small tables by the window, the sun streaming in and lighting up the room. Tony's face was already smeared with blue ice cream, his giggles filling the air. Ashley laughed, shaking her head. "You're a mess, Ton," she said, wiping his face with a napkin. Tony just giggled more, licking his cone happily. Kiara watched them, her heart swelling with love for her family. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still struggles they would have to face. But for now, in this moment, it felt like enough. It felt like they were finally getting the chance to breathe, to be happy. As they were finishing their ice cream, the bell above the shop door chimed, and Kiara looked up. Her eyes widened when she saw who it was, Daniel, standing there with a small smile on his face. He waved when he saw them walking over. "Hey, everyone," Daniel said, his voice cheerful. "Fancy meeting you all here." Ashley looked up, her face lighting up with surprise. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" Daniel shrugged, his smile widening. "I was just walking by, saw you all in here, and thought I'd say hello." Kiara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You should get some ice cream, Daniel," she said, her voice excited. "It's really good." Daniel laughed, nodding. "Maybe I will." He looked at Ashley, his expression softening. "How have you been?" Ashley smiled, her eyes misting over. "We've been good, Daniel. Really good. Thanks to you." Daniel shook his head, his eyes filled with warmth. "You did this, Ashley. I just gave a little nudge. You're the one making things happen." Ashley's eyes glistened, and she took a deep breath. "I couldn't have done it without your help. You gave us the chance we needed." Daniel nodded, his voice gentle. "I'm just glad I could be a part of it." They talked for a while, sitting together at the small table, sharing stories and laughter. Tony, with his face still smeared with ice cream, climbed into Daniel's lap, his small hands sticky. Daniel laughed, lifting Tony into the air and making him giggle. As the sun began to set, they finally left the shop, walking back towards their neighborhood together. Daniel walked beside them, Tony holding onto his hand, his other hand in Kiara's. They walked slowly, the air cooling as the sun dipped below the horizon. When they reached their house, Ashley looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you for everything, Daniel," she said, her voice cracking. "You've given us hope again." Daniel smiled, his eyes glistening. "It was my pleasure, Ashley. You and your family are amazing, and I know that no matter what, you'll make it." Ashley nodded, her heart swelling. She reached out, wrapping Daniel in a hug. He hugged her back, his arms tight around her. Kiara watched, her eyes misting over, her heart filled with gratitude. As they finally parted, Daniel looked at Kiara, giving her a small smile. "Take care of your mom, Kiara. Keep being the amazing kid you are." Kiara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I will, Daniel. Thank you." Daniel gave them one last smile before turning and walking down the street, his figure slowly fading into the distance. Ashley watched him go, then looked down at her kids, her eyes filled with love. "Come on, you two. Let's go inside," she said softly. They walked into the house and Ashley closed the door behind them. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were truly home. She looked at Kiara, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to be okay," she said. Kiara nodded, her eyes bright with hope. "Yeah, Mom, we're going to be okay." They stood there for a moment, the warmth of their small home wrapping around them, the echoes of laughter and love filling the space. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And with each other by their sides, they knew they could face whatever came next. They knew that no matter what, they would always have each other. And that was all they needed.